Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station that you are tuned into. My name is Andy and I'll be with you for the next hour, broadcasting on Yagra and Turrbal Country. And I'm actually joined in the studio today by Ellen Roberts.
Hi listeners, what an honour and a privilege to be here on Paradigm Shift today.
We were just saying that I don't often have in-studio guests, mostly recording them with people all over the country, as I am today, but also me and Ellen will get to have a little chat here in the studio.
The election brings all the guests to the studio.
Ellen has been on the Paradigm Shift a few times from Lock the Gate and various things. I think I first interviewed you outside the Brisbane Environment Court to do with an Adani court case just a short decade ago.
That's right. That was a huge day. Yes, winning against the then Federal Environment Minister, Greg Hunt.
Fighting for the yakka skink that day.
Don't forget the ornamental snake, also very important.
That's right. Okay, well, today on the show, we're going to be talking about the climate movement. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the election in the news the last week, and it does, I guess, shape the way that we try to effect social change as a social movement, even those of us who aren't in political parties. And so climate change, it wasn't very much on the election agenda, but it is very much an issue of concern for us in the 2025. And so if we're going to be effective in our social movements on the ground, we're going to have to reflect on changing conditions of a landslide Labor win and what it means for the movement. So I have a few guests who are going to reflect on it, including Ellen, but also first we're going to hear from Wesley Morgan, who is a climate academic at the Uni of New South Wales and the Climate Council, just about what Labor's record on climate has been and what is likely to happen over the next few years policy-wise. Then I spoke to Shaun Murray from Rising Tide, who organised a big people's blockade of the world's biggest coal port, but also were active in the election campaign bird dogging politicians. I spoke to Monique Tovo from the Tomorrow Movement, who are organising a rally tomorrow, the first protest rally of Labor's term in office. It is called No More Excuses Labor, and it is happening in Brisbane. It's happening nationally, but in Brisbane at the Labor Party headquarters in South Brisbane. So we'll hear from Monique about that. And Ellen will talk a bit about your own analysis for what the climate movement should be thinking about and doing. That is what's coming up, and so let's get straight into it. I spoke this morning to Wesley Morgan about Labor's track record and policies. Let's have a listen.
Yeah, g'day. I'm Dr. Wesley Morgan, and I'm a research associate at the Institute for Climate Risk and Response at the University of New South Wales. I'm also a fellow at the Climate Council of Australia.
And we are talking climate this week on the show, which hasn't been as much of a topic in the recent election as we might have thought, but it will be a significant issue in the coming 3 years. I guess to start off with, though, let's talk about the Albanese government. The previous term. They got in, there was these teal election and a lot of talk of climate. I guess, do you want to give a quick analysis of what climate policy looked like in the Albanese government's first term?
So, yes, in the first term, I would say the Albanese government made good progress. You know, the first thing they did was they legislated a new 2030 target for Australia to cut emissions by 43% by 2030. And, the previous target had been 26%. So that was a significant increase. And really the centrepiece of how we were going to get there is by a fairly rapid build-out of renewables. So in Australia, coal-fired power is on the way out. We have these old coal-fired power plants and they need replacing, and no one's proposing replacing them with more coal. So the Albanese government really started to get some runs on the board for encouraging investment in the build-out of renewables, and wants to achieve just over 80% clean energy for Australia's electricity grid by 2030. And I mean, the way I would characterise it overall is in the right direction, incremental change, and hopefully we will see an increase in ambition in the next term of the Albanese government.
I guess one thing that they have been criticised for is, aside from those targets of Australia's energy usage, that Australia's a huge fossil fuel exporter, and that hasn't slowed down maybe as much as some people would have liked during Labor's time in office.
I think that's absolutely right, and we have to stay focused on that, because Australia's biggest contribution to the climate crisis is through our exports of coal and gas. And, over the next 5 years, for example, our exports of coal and gas, when they are burned in factories and power plants in Asia, they will create emissions roughly 3 times the emissions of the whole of Australia's domestic economy. So you might be cutting emissions at home, but if you're continuing to open new coal and gas projects, you're continuing to contribute climate pollution, and the atmosphere doesn't care if it's burned in Australia or in offshore. So there has been, unfortunately, something of a unity ticket with the major parties with regards to fossil fuel exports. Neither Labor nor the Coalition has been prepared to set a real plan for phasing out fossil fuel production for export.
What role did climate change play in this election we just had?
Well, one thing that's interesting there, Andy, is that and there's some irony there, that climate change influenced the timing of the election. So Cyclone Alfred forced the federal Labor government to delay the timing for their election. And I think that probably worked in their favour in the end, because the delay meant that the world was able to pay more attention to what Trump was doing in the United States and pay more attention to Peter Dutton. And I think Australians decided that they did not like either of those things, and so we had the election outcome that we did. But somehow, even though climate change was, literally impacting when the election was held, it wasn't really a major thing on the election agenda. The discussion was all about this being a cost of living election, and so climate policy was buried somewhat. We even saw the government and the opposition both refusing to set a new 2035 emissions target, even though Australia is supposed to do that this year as part of commitments under the Paris Agreement. So I think that's the top line message, is that climate change is still very much happening. Action is still very much urgent, but it wasn't top of the political agenda. That said, there was very clear differences between the government that was proposing to continue with the rollout of renewables. During the election campaign, Anthony Albanese announced that Australia would seek to host the UN climate talks in Adelaide next year. For his part, the opposition leader Dutton, he said that he would scrap most of the climate policies introduced by the Labor government in their first term. He said that he would prolong the use of coal and gas. He said that that hosting the UN climate talks would be quote unquote madness, and he had a proposal for nuclear power playing a role in Australia's energy grid, subsidised by Australian taxpayers to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. So there was clear policy differences, and I think it did impact the election because we saw voters willing to vote for climate-friendly independence in particular, and the coalition lost support across the country, with most voters rejecting that form of climate denial, really.
Well, looking ahead into the next 3 years, the Albanese government have a clear majority now in the lower house. What can we expect in terms of climate policy over the next few years? What have they promised in it?
So like they did in their first term, they will probably move fairly quickly to legislate a new national emissions target. So under the Paris Agreement, countries have to set a new target every 5 years, and countries are expected to set a 2035 target this year. So, the Labor government will set a 2035 emissions target. It will strengthen the safeguard mechanism, which is a policy that's intended to regulate climate pollution from heavy industry. It's a policy that has weaknesses because it allows big polluters to simply buy offsets to meet their obligations rather than actually reducing the emissions at source. But nonetheless, they will do that. They will continue to drive investment towards renewables through the capacity investment scheme that was established in their first term. Hopefully, the Labor government will revisit proposals for the National Environment Law, so for reforming the National Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So the EPBC is hopelessly out of date, and it does not deal with climate change adequately. And if Labor is brave, they will write off reform that would see us have a truly independent National Environment Protection Agency and environment laws that reflect the reality of the climate crisis and require the climate pollution that is associated with projects to be taken into account when they are considering the approval of new coal and gas projects. I think the federal government will push to host the UN climate talks with Pacific Island countries next year. I think that could be a big deal. It would be one of the biggest conferences that Australia has ever hosted, one of the biggest diplomatic summits, and it would be a chance to attract investment from abroad for Australia's domestic energy transition, but it would also be a chance to begin to have the conversation about shifting from our current role as an exporter of coal, gas and iron ore to our future role in the global economy as an exporter of goods manufactured with our renewable energy. So things like green metals. We have a big opportunity, especially in green iron, and I expect the federal government will begin to talk more about what our opportunity as a renewable superpower. A policy change that we'll see almost immediately is rebates for installing home batteries. If you're lucky enough to have your own home and a solar system, and many people in Australia do, we're one of the world's leaders when it comes to rooftop solar. There is a subsidy available as of right now for installing a home battery that would allow you to store some of that energy from your household solar, and then that energy would be dispatched in the evenings when we see peak demand. in the energy system, and that would help to stabilise Australia's energy grid. And just lastly, Andy, I do hope that the federal Labor government takes this as a mandate to press on and starts to get real about our biggest contribution to the climate crisis, which is Australia's exports of coal and gas. And we really need to start with a plan for a managed phase out of fossil fuel production.
All right. Thanks very much, Wesley.
No worries.
You're on the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, 102.1 FM. Plenty of people around the country are trying to put climate change on the election agenda and force change. And I did speak to Shaun Murray from Rising Tide about their thoughts on the election result and I guess what it means for the strategy of their group.
My name's Shaun Murray and I'm the co-founder of Rising Tide, and I help to coordinate strategy amongst other things.
So for those people who don't know about Rising Tide, could you give us a bit of a brief introduction to what the organisation does?
Yep, sure thing. We are a national movement and we are campaigning for an end to coal exports from Newcastle, the world's largest coal port, by 2030, amongst various other things, including an end to new coal and gas projects in Australia and a 78% tax on coal and gas export profits. So we're essentially a climate justice organisation, and we use a lot of direct action as a kind of cornerstone of our theory of change. Like a centrepiece of our work at the moment revolves around this annual event at the moment, which is called the People's Blockade of the world's largest coal port. That's happened last November and the November before that, and it's going to happen again at the end of November this year. Yeah, it's a mass direct action to blockade the coal port in Newcastle.
And I guess for most of the country, it was notable that there wasn't much climate rhetoric in the election this year, other than Peter Dutton's nuclear policy, which even he stopped talking about. But Rising Tide was one group who really tried to put climate on the agenda by doing what was called bird dogging and interrupting press conferences and media appearances and things like that. Can you tell us a bit about that strategy and I guess a bit of an evaluation of how it worked?
Yeah, so I mean the strategy is just, again, using disruptive tactics to interject ourselves into the public narrative at a time when the major parties don't want to talk about the climate crisis because they're both in lockstep on continuing fossil fuel expansion and coal and gas exports. Yeah, it seems like a really important role to be challenging that directly by where possible going and literally interjecting in media conferences and talking about the climate crisis or challenging them on like we challenge the coalition frequently on its nuclear power policy. So that was our strategy. We haven't done an extensive evaluation yet, but it seemed to be good bang for buck. Like we were getting noticed. We helped to really controversialise the coalition's nuclear energy policy at a critical time in the debate, I think. So, and then the media started talking about it more and noticing the coalition had stopped talking about it and wanted to stop talking about it. I think disruptive tactics like that do play a really important role in the media landscape, in public narrative, and in the way that debates are framed and conducted.
Well, looking forward, I guess, post-election, it's an interesting result. In some ways, there was a real rejection of the coalition's climate denialism, among other things, but also there's been a loss of most of the Greens out of the lower house. I guess, is there any thinking about how this election result changes what it looks like for the climate movement over the coming 3 years?
Yeah, I think the climate movement has struggled a bit, I would say, campaigning against an ALP government on climate because on the one hand, excuse me, the ALP is taking action to transition our domestic energy system to renewable energy, and good on them for that. It's like noted, and it's a lot better than the coalition would have done. And there is appetite amongst some in the ALP for climate action, like strong, meaningful climate action. But overall, Australia is still, by emissions, the second largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. And we see new massive coal and gas expansions continuing to happen. So I think, and the ALP are just better salespeople than the coalition. And they just keep pointing to the domestic energy transition that's happening and saying we're taking action on climate domestically, and everything else is sort of, up to basically international agreements, and it's the responsibility of those countries who are importing our coal and gas to reduce their emissions, rather than us taking responsibility for stop expanding coal and gas production. So I think that is a massive challenge, and part of the problem is that the world is a complex place, and as we go further into this century, we're coming into what's been described as a polycrisis, where we have multiple convergent crises, the climate crisis arguably being the largest of them. The cost of living and inequality means that climate as an issue, it has come off the sort of top tier of people's concerns at the moment, which is not to say it isn't a massive issue of concern for many, many people, but I guess the immediacy of economic pain and housing and inflation, cost of living, all of that is further up on people's hierarchy of needs in this moment. So I think that's a real challenge for the climate movement. So we essentially are seeing cooling levels of concern on the climate crisis at a time when we're passing irreversible tipping points in the climate system. So it's a massive challenge, and I think, to my mind, we need to be really students of social movement power, and to become a lot more sophisticated and thoughtful and reflective about how we build social movement power.
Well, for Rising Tide particularly, I guess, how does that kind of thinking, where does it lead you over the next 3 years? Where are you thinking that you need to target your energy?
Well, the thing we're trying to do is, again, we're having as I said, the People's Blockade in November. It's going to be a mass mobilisation of thousands and thousands of people. It's going to be a huge disruptive protest. Last year there were 170 people arrested. It's quite possible or likely there will be more taking that sort of action this year. Basically, I see us as being on an escalatory pathway because circumstances just necessitate and dictate that course of action. So a big moment that's coming up globally on climate is going to be COP 2026. It's going to be presumably hosted in Australia and co-hosted with Pacific Island nations. I think that's going to be probably November 2026, and that will be a key test of social movement muscle in Australia to see whether we can really force the inaction of our country into the media frame and keep it there to expose and embarrass our government at a time when they're trying to do critical diplomatic work with Pacific Islands countries. And the more that those Pacific Island nations are calling unequivocally for an end to coal and gas expansion, I think it's incumbent on us in Australia to be holding our government to account on that demand, and that COP31 is just going to be a critical opportunity to do that.
Well, before then, as you mentioned, your next big convergence will be this November, and the dates have just been announced for the flotilla. Do you want to give a final plug for it?
Yeah, sure thing. There's a Facebook event, or you can go to risingtide.org.au. It's the 27th of November, the full convergence, through to the 2nd of December. So it's a 6-day event. And the main action will take place on the Saturday and Sunday, the 29th and 30th of November, which will be a mass flotilla on the water, as well as a climate concert with headline acts performing.
All right, thanks very much, Shaun.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate the chat.
Here on The Paradigm Shift, that is Shaun Murray from Rising Tide, talking about, I guess, how they view the terrain now for the climate movement post-election. They've just announced that they will be having another people's blockade of the world's biggest coal port at the end of November. And someone who was there last November is sitting with me in the studio right now, Ellen Roberts. Not just there, but out on the water, paddling a kayak in the shipping channel and getting arrested, Ellen.
I did, yeah. And just before we move on, I mean, Rising Tide did such great stuff in the election. I'm not sure that Shaun went into it in detail, but I don't know if you remember Shaun and Zach, both from Rising Tide, attending one of Angus Taylor's press conferences and pretending to be community radio journalists. And then moving seamlessly into bird dogging him and asking him about his nuclear policies. And Angus Taylor there just looking very confused, had no idea what was going on, and just sort of aborted the press conference. So I thought that was a particularly clever intervention from those guys. But, you know, only one of many, as we saw, interrupting Peter Dutton on multiple occasions, as well as Albo. So Rising Tide very active in the election campaign.
And in our own city of Brisbane, there are quite a few Rising Tide people getting out there and intervening in stage-managed political media appearances. Yeah,
because we have seen, obviously, elections become much more sort of sanitised and stage-managed, so I thought Rising Tide did a really good job. Apparently they were much loved by the media pack for their sort of colourful interventions.
Breaking the monotony of election coverages of scripted press conferences.
Yes, yeah. So yes, Rising Tide, and I think like building a very impressive social movement based in Newcastle, but there's a very active Rising Tide group here in Brisbane as well. So yeah, doing amazing work.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the things Shaun talked about then is like this theory of social movement building. Yeah, which I guess is separate to necessarily ideas about political power, of how to gain political seats, ideas of how to build grassroots power. And that's something that they're really working on, this movement strategy, rather than, I guess, instant political impact strategy.
I think that's right. I mean, I think hopefully they achieve both. Certainly the blockades are high profile and do highlight Australia's coal exports, but yes, they're very interested in the kind of movement building momentum side of it. I mean, I think like just in an election context, one thing that I think may have got a bit forgotten in the election wash-up, I was actually at Ellie Smith, who was running as an independent for Dixon, at her election night party, and she didn't win or come second in Dixon, but the mood in that party was, the vibes are extremely high, and I think that's partly obviously what happened with Dutton on the night, but also people were just really buoyed by the kind of work that they'd done, and that there is a kind of a social movement developing around independence. People are putting hours and hours and hours of their own time, donating heaps of money as well into getting independents elected. And so I think that's a really big feature of the Australian political landscape now, that we should be thinking about who are those people and what motivates them. If we're thinking, in the context of movement building, that this is something that's really emerged in a really strong way, and I think will continue to play a really important role.
And I think with climate, there's an understanding that politicians from the major parties are just caught in this machine of fossil fuel companies and being forced to appease these sort of companies and their political power, and that the system's broken, and so that something else needs to happen. And I think the independence movement is a recognition of that.
Yeah, I mean, interesting to see how long-lived it is, and there's probably very different characters in different places, but there's something about, people aren't joining political parties, but they're not joining the majors in the same way. But we've seen really big engagement, as I said, from both the Greens and the Independents. Some people very climate motivated. So I think, yes, maybe climate as a pure issue wasn't front and centre in the election, but if you look at who was door knocking, who was wearing out the shoe leather, who are the people that were standing out there on the side of the road in Dixon with Ellie Smith signs, or Cowper, in Coffs Harbour, I had a friend who was very active down there. All of the big independent campaigns, all of the community members that were putting so much time and energy into it. It's really those independence campaigns. So exciting, I think, development.
And I guess for you, you're a part of a environmental organisation that's very much focused on fossil fuels, which is Lock the Gate. Have there been reflections within Lock the Gate about what the election means and how strategy will change?
Yeah, I think obviously the ALP has done some things, but we had very high hopes as an organisation that the federal environment laws would change and that they would start taking climate change into account, which would mean that there would potentially be coal and gas projects not approved. And as we know, it took a few phone calls from West Australia, probably the most mining captured state in Australia. Even though we're in Queensland here, obviously the mining lobby is extremely powerful here in Queensland, but I think WA, it's just that next level up as well. So WA really scuppering those plans. So we've been very disappointed about how Labor's performed on our particular issues. I agree with Shaun. Obviously, domestic energy transition is important, but in terms of rethinking the way that we approach coal and gas, it has been very disappointing. And so it's difficult to see what the opportunities are to shift that from Labor going forward. It's an interesting time. They are going to have to make a commitment around our Paris Agreement goals this year, so the climate will certainly be on the agenda, and they're also looking at how they're going to drive down emissions across the Australian economy, including in the mining sector. But I think it's really back to the streets. It's really about building social movement power, as it always has been. We can never rely on governments. But I think people would be naive in the extreme if they imagined that Albo was entering this term of government with environment on his number one to-do list. I think that would be very naive.
I guess it's interesting to compare in Queensland when Labor was coming up to an election which they were almost certainly going to lose, and they went all out and actually gained some wins for the environment and sort of took on the power of the mining companies with mining royalties. And this thing there was nothing to lose, and so they went for it. Whereas in the lead up to this election, Labor's proposed environmental changes just got put off or totally scuppered as this thing of we can't risk it. I guess that's the thing, when Labor tries to play it safe, it's bad news for the environment, but when they do need to take action, that's when I guess there's possibilities for social movements to have impact.
Of course, yeah. I mean, yeah. And hopefully Labor's not going to learn the wrong lessons out of this election in particular. And I think it is important to remember the global context. And yes, people don't want to see, Trump-style exiting the Paris Agreement commitments here in Australia. So we've obviously avoided the worst of the excesses. But I do think that, unfortunately, what's happened with the Greens may also impact Labor's ambition on climate change as well.
Yeah, and certainly a bit less accountability in Parliament without, outspoken Greens in the lower house.
Yeah. But I think in terms of the only thing that really has effectively defeated coal and gas projects, and there have been many in Australian history, is genuine grassroots local community movements, So I think that's just what we need to return to. Obviously, working with those frontline communities, traditional owners, landholders who are most impacted by coal and gas, and that's the power in the movement. That's Lock the Gates kind of focus and strategy, and I think now more than ever that's going to be the thing that sees us actually start to shift away from these big expansions.
Yes. Well, I've got one more interview. We are talking about climate movement and where next for it following the election, and some people have some ideas of the Tomorrow Movement who are organising rallies this weekend. You'll hear more about in this interview with Monique Tovo.
So, my name is Monique. I'm from Tomorrow Movement. My background in the organisation is I'm the comms lead and organiser, and I'm based on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. Tomorrow Movement is an unstoppable movement of young people that's fighting for good jobs, great public services, and a safe climate for all. And we're a national-based movement that is also fighting for, a future for everybody, not just big business.
Yeah, I guess over the years we've seen a lot of different groups in the climate activism space. Do you want to tell us a bit more about specifically what Tomorrow Movement focuses on and what you see its role as in the kind of activist ecosystem?
Yeah, no, there are a lot of organisations in the climate ecosystem, and what sets apart is our strong intersectional approach, also highly critical of the role that big business has played in where the climate is today. So across the years since Tomorrow Movement was established, which was prior to the last federal election, we've really called out vested interests from big business that are at play, and also how that's not just impacting the climate, it's impacting the jobs that we have, the houses that we sleep in, and resources and food that we have access to. Tomorrow Movement is a really intersectional movement that looks at everything that is impacting the climate crisis.
Speaking of tomorrow, around the country tomorrow there will be a number of rallies called the Labor No More Excuses Rally. Can you tell us a bit about what's the motivation for this?
Yeah, so prior to the federal election, Tomorrow Movement was running a national youth voter bloc, and that's because Gen Z and millennials make up the largest voting bloc in the population. And, with this federal election result, we wanted to show Labor that there is no hesitation across all movements to say that there is no more excuses for them to create transformative change that we need to avoid any more impending doom that comes with the climate crisis, and really make sure that all the population is lifted out of the cost of living and housing crisis. So the No More Excuses demand is a real culmination of the last 4 years of Tomorrow Movement's campaigning, but is also a step on the first day to let Labor know that we see that they also have vested big businesses interests. Both of the old parties do, and we really need corporate donation reforms and political lobbying reforms. So this action is a first step to let them know that we're going to be hot on their tails for the next 3 years.
I guess it's an interesting dynamic with the government for the next 3 years. Many were hoping for a hung parliament with Greens and minor parties being in a role to have leverage for negotiation, which obviously hasn't happened. But I suppose the rejection of the nuclear power plan and the coalition's kind of climate denialism at least means you don't have to waste energy on kind of fighting that. I guess how do you see the gains and losses from the makeup of the new parliament?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and there's been really interesting discussions around whether or not this election was a win for the climate movement, and that somebody that's actively, watched Labor and how they, do small-scale reform and not the transformative change. I've got to say that I personally am not very happy with this election result, but I do agree that it is good that nuclear is off the table. But when we look at the whole spectrum that impacts the climate crisis, and that includes, making sure that we have First Nations sovereignty in this country, that we are treating refugees with respect and the dignity that they deserve, that we are having broad-scale conversations around how we deal with racism and, how that impacts the climate solutions that are implemented. I am really hesitant to say that any of that will be discussed under this government. So that's why it's really important that Tomorrow Movement or progressive movements push the Labor government from day one to say, no, we just can't have a lot of discussions and nasty words in Parliament. We really need to have broad-scale reform that addresses the scale of the crisis that we're living in.
So for Tomorrow Movement, what will your strategy look like over this term of government?
Yeah, we're in a really interesting moment in Tomorrow Movement. So our organisation has a 5-year strategy that has just come into a close now. So we are hoping to find a next, a lot of young people to refresh what Tomorrow Movement looks like in this next round of government and beyond. So this rally is on this action is a really exciting starting gun for the next race of Tomorrow Movement, where we really look at what worked and what hasn't worked over the last 5 years, and really what does the next generation of young people want to campaign for, want to fight for, and what does that strategy look like for Tomorrow Movement.
All right, thanks very much, Monique, for chatting with us today.
Thanks, Andy.
You are listening to 4ZZZ, and we were just hearing from Monique Tovo from Tomorrow Movement, and we've been talking all about climate strategy and how it's affected by the election. Any parting thoughts, Ellen?
I mean, I think that the election result was positive in so many ways, in terms of turning away from nuclear energy and sort of re-embracing the importance of global action. But as we've heard from Monique and from Shaun, it is time to get to the streets. There's so many people who feel so passionate about climate action, and there's opportunities to be a part of the social movement that's really going to hold the ALP government to account. It's the only thing that ever has or will. So heaps of opportunities coming up November later this year, and even tomorrow to be part of.
And we will keep bringing you news on the paradigm shift of people out there trying to make a better world, trying to fix our environmental issues and many social issues. And so keep tuning in. See you next week.